Good day. Today is Tuesday, 24th December 2024, and it is in fact Christmas Eve. And may I first of all take this opportunity, therefore, to wish everybody who's watching this program, the entire Duran community on locals and elsewhere, all of you, a very happy Christmas and a prosperous and joyful Christmas, and may all be best for you and for your loved ones and for your friends and family. Thank you for all of the support you've given, and I hope you have a happy holiday this Christmas. Now, speaking for myself, I am obviously making a program today, though this program definitely is going to be shorter than the usual programs that I make. Tomorrow, Christmas Day, and the day after, Boxing Day, I am taking off. I'm taking as leave. I'm going to spend Christmas Day and Boxing Day with my family, with my wife and my 3 daughters and my niece who's also with us. So I'll be back after the Christmas holiday, as usual, at least until the New Year, when of course I will also be taking New Year's Day off. But no videos from me tomorrow on Christmas Day or on the day after. And in the meantime, just to reiterate again, today's video is definitely going to be shorter than the usual videos that I do. So with all of that, let's go straight in and discuss the current situation. And I'm going to be try to be as comprehensive as I can in the relatively limited time that I have. Firstly, there's been a lot more news over the last 24 hours from the Ukrainian battlefronts, and it paints an extremely grim picture for the situation, for Ukraine's military situation. First of all, it's increasingly looking to me as if there is an ongoing disaster for the Ukrainians playing out in the KURSK salient around Sudzha. There's much claims, much discussion that this is all down to the arrival of the North Korean troops. There's all sorts of talk that the North Koreans are taking enormous casualties. There's an article today somewhere in the US media which says that the North Korean deployments to Kursk were Kim Jong-un's idea, not Putin's idea, and that so far there's no sign that Kim Jong-un has received anything from Putin in return. There are also further claims that 60% of the shells that the Russians fire in the war, and most of the ground launch missiles that they launch are of North Korean manufacture. And there's also large numbers of reports that the North Koreans are busy producing suicide drones, which they're also going to supply to the Russians in large volumes and large quantities. I have to say straight away that actual evidence confirming any of this is barely available. I've seen no real proof that there are any North Korean troops in Kursk region at all. All of the photos of soldiers who've been fighting are made from a distance. It's impossible to tell whether they are actually North Koreans, whether the shells do indeed come from North Korea, whether the missiles come from North Korea. Well, maybe they do, but I would like to see at least a little evidence that this is actually the case. Put all that aside. Ask yourself what is actually happening in Kursk region, where the North Korean troops are said to be active, and it is an increasingly grim, I would go further, I'd say a disastrous picture. We now have more reports that the Ukrainian troops there are increasingly demoralized. that they're trying to create fortifications around Sudzha itself, that the Russians are now on the outskirts of Malaya Loknia, which is the next important village that they want to capture. I gather, by the way, that Malaya Loknia, which has been fought over many times, is a very small place. But anyway, apparently, in some way, it has acquired some kind of importance, some kind of military importance or strategic value in the ongoing battle. And anyway, the battle for Malaya Loknia is about to restart, and it looks as if the Russians are going to capture it. And it also seems that the Russians are firmly in control again, or at least are advancing on those two villages with the similar names, Ruskaya and Cherkasskaya Porechnoye. They control already the village of Cherkasskaya Konopielka. This is a completely different village. There's two different villages. There's Ruskaya Konopielka and Cherkasskaya Konopielka, which are immediately to the east, the southeast of Sudzha, and there is Ruskaya Porechnoye and Cherkasskoye Porechnoye, which are to the north of Sudzha. Anyway, Ruskaya Konopielka and Cherkasskaya Konopielka, both very close to Sudzha. Indeed, south of Sudzha. Apparently, they've both fallen under Russian control, and the Russians, it's said, are in the process of capturing the two northern villages, Ruskoye Porechnoye and Cherkasskoye Porechnoye. And in the meantime, they're advancing through a village called Viktorova towards Malaya Loknaya from the west as well. So we can see that the pincers around, the northern pincers around Sudzha are closing and closing fast. And a couple of days ago, there were reports that the Russians have re-established themselves in Martinovka, which is located immediately to the northeast of Sudzha on the main road to KURSK region. Doesn't seem as if that is true, at least not so far. But there are reports this morning that the Russians, having recently captured Darino and perhaps Nikolaevo Darino, that there are disputes about whether the Russians do indeed control that second village, Nikolaevo Darino. But anyway, there are reports that the Russians are pushing towards Sverdlikovo, the biggest village to the west of Sudzha, immediately to the west of Sudzha, along the main road, a road leading westwards from Sudzha. And of course, it's widely acknowledged that if Sverdlikovo falls, then with the Russians already in control of Plyokhovo to the south, the Russians having crossed the Psol River west of Plyokhovo, with the Russians apparently pushing towards a village called Kurilovka, which is located immediately to the south of Sudzha. Well, it's starting to look as if Sudzha, which the Ukrainians are now fortifying, is gradually being surrounded. Now, I say all of this, I'm not the best person to read maps, as I've discussed in many places, but the situation in Sudzha, in KURSK region, looks extraordinarily grim. And one does wonder, again, at the logic of keeping Ukrainian troops in possession, in control of a small town of 5,000 to 6,000 people, right on the border between Russia and Ukraine, a small town which has no strategic value in itself, which is purely symbolic in its importance, at least to the Ukrainians. the larger operation in Kursk region, the attempt to advance northwards, possibly to capture, well, the Russians believe to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant, and of course I believe the same. Well, all of that failed way back in August. Is it really worthwhile fighting so hard to cling on to these positions in Kursk, to this one small town, which, as I said, is close now, within weeks now of being surrounded, with many of Ukraine's best forces located there? Well, the Ukrainian General Staff, Zelensky and Syrsky, are perhaps the best people to answer that question. I personally cannot see the logic to any of this at all. So a disaster is playing out in Kursk region. I get the sense, by the way, though we get very, very few reports about this nowadays, people have basically lost interest in what's going on in Kharkiv region, in Volchansk. It's an interesting fact that despite the fact that Group of Forces North has had to divide its forces between Kursk region and Kharkiv region, and despite the fact that the Ukrainians concentrated large numbers of forces to this area, including some of their best forces, it's interesting that the Ukrainians were never able to reverse the gains that the Russians made in Kharkiv region, in northern Kharkiv region, following the Russian advance into Kharkiv region, which took place back in May. All of the villages that the Russians captured then, so far as I'm aware, along the border between Kharkiv region and Belgorod region in Russia, remain under Russian control. The Russians are still camped around Lipsy, the village which lies equidistant between the Russian border and the city of Kharkiv. The Russians have made no serious attempts to capture Lipsy. The Ukrainians have made various sporadic attempts to push the Russians back, but all of those have been unsuccessful. And we're getting lots of reports. Well, not lots of reports, but we are getting reports which suggest that the situation in Volchansk is now gradually coming to a conclusion, that the Russians control the aggregate plant and the industrial area in northern Volchansk and the high-rise building area, and that they're now gradually clearing the areas still under Ukrainian control north of the Volcha River in northern Volchansk. The battle full of Volchansk is likely to end, I'm going to guess, fairly quickly after the Ukrainians are finally expelled from Kursk region. But anyway, who knows? Maybe it's more complicated than I realize. Anyway, elsewhere, the Russians appear to have made significant progress in the Kupiansk area and in the area of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. They've apparently significantly enlarged their bridgehead north of Kupiansk, west of the Oskol River. They're in the process of capturing certain important villages and small towns in this area. And yesterday, there were reports circulating that the Russians have now finally captured and cleared the village of Tierny on the Zherebets River. Now, this is, of course, an area that is a village that had gained a certain notoriety at one point way back, as I recall, in the spring. A Russian force moved towards Tierny across the fields from the east and was FPV droned by the Ukrainians, and there were all kinds of claims and reports that that the Ukrainians had gained some great victory in the fight for Terni, and that the Russians had suffered appalling losses. Well, maybe so, but the fact remains, and this is of course the story, right the way through in all the battles and fighting that has taken place in this sort of area, in this area, the fact remains that it does seem as if Terni is indeed about to fall under Russian control. And the fall of Terni, along with the other villages immediately to the north, potentially opens the way for a Russian advance towards Liman, though whether that is indeed going to happen and what the Russian plans there are, I'm not really able to say. Anyway, further south, in Chasiv Yar, we now have confirmation that the Russians have captured another of the micro-districts in the town. This is the Novi micro-district, located to the north of the industrial area. The Russians apparently captured the industrial area, including the refractory plant, about a week ago. Then the Ukrainians counterattacked. The Ukrainians claimed to have recaptured the refractory plant. Whether they really did or not, or whether they're still in the industrial sector, I'm far from sure. We've had many reports and claims at various times of successful Ukrainian counterattacks. There was a counterattack in Volchansk some months back, in which led to claims that the Ukrainians were once again in control of the aggregate plant, and Group of Forces North seemed to confirm it, and Ukrainian soldiers in the aggregate plant were flying the Ukrainian flag, and then a few days later it was confirmed that the Russians were back in full control of the aggregate plant in Volchansk. And similar things have happened in other places. In Toretsk, there was a lot of claims that the Russians were in control of the Zabalka district, and then the Ukrainians supposedly counterattacked and recaptured the Zabalka district, except that a few days later it looked as if the Russians were again in control of the Zabalka district. I'm going to say that I suspect that many of these Ukrainian counterattacks are simply further evidence of Russian tactical retreats of the sort discussed 2 years ago by a U.S. Marine officer in the U.S. Marine Corps Journal. The Russians retreating from territory that they've captured and have charted and studied and measured carefully. The Ukrainians then advance into it, and they discover that they're back, that they find themselves in a fire trap with the Russian artillery able to pound them. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see the same thing happening in Chasiv Yar. Suffice to say that even if the Ukrainians have re-entered or even recaptured the industrial district, other parts of Chasiv Yar seem to be falling back under Russian control quite rapidly. And in Toretsk, where about a month ago we were also hearing all sorts of claims about successful Ukrainian counterattacks, a large area of the town has again fallen under Russian control over the last 24 hours. As far as I can see, the territory in Toretsk that remains under Ukrainian control is now limited to a few residential districts in the north. I'm guessing around 80 to 90% of the town. Maybe that's an overstatement. I'm not good at maps. But anyway, the great bulk of the town, or at least of the urban conurbation of which Toretsk is the heart, seems to be falling rapidly under the control of the Russians. So again, it's a case of the Russians gradually clearing up in Toretsk, and doing it quite rapidly. Meanwhile, we're also getting further reports that the Russians have made further progress in the Kurakovo area, clearing the villages, and in the Pokrovsk area, various Ukrainian advances, Ukrainian attacks towards Russian positions south of Pokrovsk. It looks as if all that is the result of these attacks is that the Ukrainians are suffering increasingly heavy losses and that the Russians are able gradually to tighten their grip on Pokrovsk. And lastly, it looks as if in the area of the village of Velikaya Novosilka, the Russians have now captured two of the important villages located there, Storozhevye and Makarivka, and the road from Velikaya Novosilka to Gulyapolye has definitely been cut, so that the Ukrainian troops in Velikaya Novosilka are indeed, in effect, the supply routes into this small town are indeed cut, and the Ukrainian troops there are indeed, well, taken into a cauldron, I think is the right word. They are in effect surrounded. It looks like the whole situation is playing out again very much in the same sort of way that it did in Ugledar. And in fact, we have a report about this from our old friend Vladimir Rogov. He says that northwest of the settlement of Storozhevoye, our troops have approached the Gulyapolye Velikaya Novosilka road and brought it under fire control, not just with artillery, but also with anti-tank guided missiles and firearms. Neither the deployment of Ukrainian troops nor the supply of ammunition or equipment is possible. Everything is exposed to fire. So a disastrous situation altogether. But in the meantime, the current administration in Washington shows no sign of easing off against the Russians. Their various attempts to create problems between the new administration, the incoming administration, and the Russians, that seems to be unceasing. And we have had a further report in the Washington Post saying that the current president, President Biden, is considering new large-scale sanctions against the Russian energy sector. And we're told that this decision is allegedly intended to give the new administration leverage in Ukraine talks, though that's scarcely probable. It's intended to do the exact opposite. And of course, one wonders whether these new sanctions are in fact even being discussed with the incoming Trump team. But anyway, we're told that the sanctions, if they are imposed, which of course they will be, I discussed this all fairly recently in a discussion of a similar article in Bloomberg, that the new sanctions will target foreign ships transporting Russian oil to non-Western countries, as well as Russian oil exporters who have not yet been included in the sanctions list. And possible options also include revoking the license that allows banks to handle transactions with Russian energy resources. Now, the last is fascinating because, of course, the administration recently imposed sanctions on Gazprom Bank, which is the bank that some countries use to transfer funds to Russia in return for receiving gas supplied by Russia. This has happened with Turkey and with a number of other countries, Hungary, Slovakia, all of those things. This created numerous protests and many, many complaints. And over the last few weeks, about last week or so, the US Treasury has actually been quietly easing the sanctions on Gazprom Bank because of the annoyance and anger that this has caused amongst some of the US's own allies, which still depend on Russian energy resources. Turkey has been amongst the most vociferous. Well, completely unsurprisingly, President Biden, who continues to be obsessed, as far as I can see, with Ukraine and with Putin in particular and with Russia altogether, and his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, and his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. Apparently they've been angered by these restrictions, the easing of the restrictions on Gazprom Bank, and they've been infuriated by the fact that Russian trade continues and they are out to make more trouble again. So they come along and they're again tightening or trying to tighten the restrictions even more. And even though this is clearly intended to make life for the new administration as difficult as possible, it's packaged and explained as being intended to strengthen the position of the Trump team in the forthcoming talks. If Trump's people want to gain leverage over the Russians, then of course they can be left to impose sanctions themselves. There is no obvious or logical reason why the existing administration would do it in their place. Just saying, surely these are decisions for the new administration, not the current administration to make. But there we are. It's not in any way surprising. The current team has done everything it possibly can to create as much trouble as possible, and nobody should in any way be surprised about this. Now, needless to say, all that this is going to do is create more trouble and anger on the Russian side. It's probably not going to affect any talks that do eventually take off, and it's not going to affect the outcome of the war. Recently, India has entered into a long-term agreement with Russia for the supply of oil. I get the sense that the Indians have now come to see this as essential to their own long-term economic position. The Russians will have little difficulty finding other ships to transport their oil. Putting aside the question of whether ships can be sanctioned and what effect that would do, the fact is that the Russians can always buy ships. There is never any shortage of ships that people will be prepared to sell and which the Russians would be able to buy, and it can all be done through all kinds of intermediaries and in all sorts of ways. This will have a temporary effect, but it will not have a long-term one. It will, of course, cause energy costs to grow, at least in the short term, putting further pressure on inflation, global inflation, which is currently rising. This has had an effect in the United States, where the Federal Reserve Board is now saying that it's going to ease off on its current policy of cutting rates. The same could be true in Europe, with the ECB also apparently now becoming less willing to continue its rate cutting policies. But it's clear that the current administration and the people who run it, they're about to leave office. They're not concerned about these things. If there is more inflation and there is more trouble, well, so be it. The problem is entirely one to be dealt with by Donald Trump. Ever since that article appeared in Bloomberg about a week ago or 2 weeks ago, saying that the administration was preparing to impose additional sanctions on the Russian energy sector, I have been saying that as night follows day, those sanctions are indeed going to be imposed. Anyway, In the meantime, we've had a few further comments by all sorts of people. Zelensky has been extremely infuriated by Fico's trip to Moscow, which I discussed in my program yesterday. He's saying that Ukraine had offered to compensate Slovakia for any losses it had suffered as a result of the cut-off of energy from Russia, the pipeline energy from Russia. Zelensky's making an offer, which of course he can't fulfill. How is Ukraine going to compensate Slovakia? I read a report, I'm not completely sure that this is true, that 90% of Ukraine's financing needs are being covered by Western aid. And I get the sense that energy in Ukraine, to the extent that Ukraine continues to use energy, is now almost entirely or largely imported from the West. So how is a country that is both bankrupt and facing catastrophic energy shortages going to compensate Slovakia for the cut-off of energy supplies? Of course, if what Zelensky means is that Ukraine's European allies will do this, well, that might be another matter, though again, it perhaps is fair to point out that Europe is also suffering energy shortages. Gas prices across Europe are rising at the moment. There are reports that the situation in Europe's energy storage facilities is, well, it's not critical, but it's getting lower because of the cold winter and many other things of that kind. So, what exactly does Zelensky mean? And besides, if he's talking about the Europeans, this is not really a matter within his control. It's a matter within the control of other European governments. It's particularly absurd, given that, as I discussed in my program yesterday, though energy matters undoubtedly did play a part in the discussion that Fico had with Zelensky, with Putin, I doubt that it was the main topic of discussion between the two men. Well, perhaps we can leave it to Zelensky. I've seen some references to Zelensky offering Fico a bribe. What he publicly has offered would not, I think, be a bribe. I mean, if it's a case of Slovakia being compensated in some way for a cut-off of energy supplies from Russia, that would not be a bribe. Of course, if something was offered personally to Fico himself, that would be, but we have no report to that effect. Anyway, one way or the other, the whole story makes absolutely no sense at all. I would say that the British diplomat Ian Proud, on the topic of Ukraine, has been making the point recently that the Western powers over the last couple of months have been moving quietly from a position of providing Ukraine with grants to a point today when they appear to be offering Ukraine loans instead. In other words, Western funding to Ukraine is increasingly taking the form of loan finance as opposed to grant finance. I am not sure what actual difference that makes, because of course the Ukrainians receive the money and nobody seriously supposes that they're ever going to pay it back. But anyway, that's what's being said. Meanwhile, Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, has given an interview to Marwar Nemzet a Hungarian newspaper, and he predicts that the war is going to end in 2025. He says the war will end in 2025. It will end either with a peace agreement or with the collapse of one of the belligerents. He doesn't say which of the two belligerents, but he obviously means Ukraine, because, to be clear, whatever sanctions or trouble the current administration makes, it's not going to cause Russia to collapse. But then he goes on to say America and Europe have spent about 300 billion euros on the war. With this money, we could have achieved a fast rise in the standard of living in all of Europe. We could have raised the entire Balkans to the level of European development. We could have curbed migration and built a completely new European defense system. But this money was wasted. Millions have left Ukraine, whose infrastructure, transport and energy systems have been ruined. The country will be unable to support itself economically in the foreseeable future. I have no argument with any of those points, just saying. Meanwhile, there's been a very interesting article in the Daily Telegraph, which brings us back to Eve Smith's point, the one I mentioned again and again, about how the Western powers, in advance of a negotiation, spent all of the time debating with each other the position they're going to take in the negotiation with the third party, this time Russia. By the time they've completed the process of sorting out their terms with each other and begin the negotiation with the other side, the terms that they've agreed to put have lost all contact with reality because they ignore what the other side has been consistently saying. And there is, in this article in the Daily Telegraph by Francis Dearnley, an admission of this very point. The article reads, the title is, "There is a question no one dares ask about Vladimir Putin." That is not true, by the way. I've asked it many times. So has Alex Christoforou. So have all sorts of other people. And of course, Eve Smith has asked it frequently also. But the question is, negotiations to end the war may begin in early 2025. But what happens if Putin refuses a ceasefire? This is exactly the point that's been made repeatedly on these programs and which Eve Smith made in a recent article. And we then have a discussion about the fact that all kinds of meetings have recently been taking place in Europe, that there's been long discussions about ceasefires, peacekeeping forces, all that sort of thing. Orban, apparently over the course of this meeting at the European Council, stressed that there's actually been no agreement and no consensus made. And then Dearnley, the author of this article, says historians may well look back on this meeting as Europe's admission that it's left itself no choice but to seek a festive miracle from across the Atlantic, hoping that Donald Trump will soon carve out a favourable peace deal with Putin. But all of this is predicated on one massive assumption, that Russia will meaningfully come to the negotiating table in early 2025. When he says meaningfully come to the negotiating table, what he means is that the Russians will agree to all of these proposals for ceasefires, peacekeeping forces, and all of that, which the Europeans have been talking about. And then he goes on to say, what no one seems to be asking is, what if they don't? Well, of course, to repeat again, it's not true that no one has been asking that question. But anyway, never mind. He then goes on to say this: given the battlefield dynamics and Moscow's objectives, many convincingly argue that Putin will continue waging war for as long as his economy allows him to. The Kremlin may posture as conciliatory in January, claiming openness to meaningful talks, but what if its proposals are unacceptable to Ukraine and its allies? Well, there's no mystery about this. The Russians have already set out their position. Putin set it out in June in his speech to the Foreign Ministry. And as I have repeatedly pointed out in program after program after program, the Russians have not shifted one iota from that position since then. And then Dearly goes on to say this is a crucial question that seems to be almost entirely ignored in Europe. For America, the choice might be easy: pull out. What then for a Europe which has failed to prepare adequately for that scenario and yet cannot let Kiev fail? It's always a humbling experience to go on saying, repeating the same point again and again, hammering it away in program after program on this channel, to do so for weeks and sometimes months, and then to find suddenly, bang, an article appear in the mainstream media that finally, very late in the day, desperately late in the day, acknowledges the point that I have always been making. Well, here we have it. Nobody in Europe apparently is considering all of this. They're all doing exactly what Eve Smith warned about. They're busy talking and discussing and debating proposals to be made to the Russians with each other. They assume that the Russians, as soon as they accept those proposals, will suddenly make the decision to capitulate to the Western demands, that there won't be any real negotiations. And then, of course, the shock, the surprise, when things turn out otherwise. And of course the article does go on to say all kinds of things about how the Russians might concede after all, how their economy might even buckle, how military events might turn out badly for them. All this set out at length, but then he goes on to say, this is the most optimistic scenario, and even it entails a longer, bloodier war. That is why it has proved so disastrous for Europe not to demonstrate its capacity, both in moral and military terms, to support Ukraine, not only to fight, but also potentially to win decisively. The trouble is, and again, it's astonishing that people like Dearly and others simply don't get this fact. Europe has done everything it could. So has the United States. They've given Ukraine ultimately all of the weapons Ukraine has ever asked for. Tanks, Germany's just supplied another, I believe, 15 Leopard 2 tanks. The United States eventually gave Ukraine every single type of weapon that it asked for. And the F-16s were not supplied directly by the United States, but they were supplied by the European states with American permission. The United States has given Ukraine long-range or medium-range cruise missiles, the ATACMS, which many people were agitating and begging for. And, well, none of that has made a difference. And the reason is that the Russian army is very strong and becoming stronger, and Russia's military industrial base has been massively underestimated, and, well, possibly, as I discussed at the beginning of the program, the Russians are also getting weapons from North Korea, though whether that is really the case, who knows. But anyway, that's always the baffling thing about these people who write these things, always it's assumed that victory is possible through some exercise of the will. Questions of capability and resources are never properly discussed. Anyway, there we are. More mischief from the administration in the last weeks of its existence, but the military situation continues to go from disastrous to catastrophic. Ukrainian attacks and counterattacks, all unsuccessful, and perhaps because the situation has become as bad as it is, reports now that there have been serious attempts made in Ukraine to shut down DS, one of the most important mapping projects made about the war. They're based, of course, in Ukraine. They've had a long-standing relationship with the general staff there. They provide lots of information about the progress of the war. Many people, I think, perhaps excessively rely on them to get a sense of what is happening in the war. Well, a couple of days ago, people suddenly noticed that DS was no longer publishing updates, that it had become silent. Then Mariana Bezuglaya, the dissident Ukrainian MP, said that the general staff, the military in Ukraine, had become exasperated with DS because it was publishing too much negative information about the war, and that the staff at DS were all being conscripted into the army and were going to be sent to the battlefronts. And then DS itself came out and admitted that there was dissension between itself and the military leadership, and a lot of the fingers were pointed at General Syrsky himself as the top military commander, who supposedly had made this decision to close down DS, though, of course, I've seen no confirmation of this. Anyway, it could be that there's been so much negative reaction to these moves against DS, which I ought to say I do consider to be a very good mapping project. It is one of the mapping projects that one must take into account if one is to understand what is going on in the war. I say that, though, as I said, I think it's dangerous to over-rely on them. But anyway, perhaps because there's been so much of a negative reaction to these apparent moves to close it down, there are today updates on DS which suggest that it's been granted a reprieve and that it's back in business. Updates, all of which, by the way, appear to confirm further Russian advances. So there we are. DS hanging by a thread. Somebody in Kiev decided that the time had come to shoot the messenger because of the bad news that's piling up. But the messenger, for once, has been reprieved. Probably, just to say, they owe, at DS, Bezuglaya a big word of thanks. I just want to finish with two further topics. Firstly, in South Korea, the political crisis there continues. President Yoon remains in office. He continues to refuse to resign, but the parliament has passed an impeachment vote. There is no certainty that it will be validated by South Korea's constitutional court. it will require all of the judges in this court, all the serving judges in this court, to vote to confirm the impeachment, and that's far from guaranteed. Apparently, the court itself is well below strength because there's been so many arguments and disputes about filling the vacancies. Anyway, the acting president of South Korea is acting President Han, who happens to be a member of President Yoon's own party. He's been quite critical of President Yoon over the course of the martial law decree, but he too has been resisting attempts to conduct investigations into President Yoon's handling of events. And now the parliament is apparently moving to impeach him as well. It looks like a deepening and very messy political crisis. And the obvious solution to it is for there to be new elections. But I get the sense that the current establishment in South Korea is digging in and clinging on, no doubt because they fear that if there are new elections, the opposition not only will win them, but will win them by an overwhelming majority. And investigations could then be launched in a serious way to establish what really happened as a result of the martial law decree. And that might be very, very embarrassing, not just to various people within the South Korean political and especially military establishment, but I would suggest amongst some of South Korea's allies, including perhaps the current administration in the United States. Anyway, that's South Korea. Much more interesting is further reports about a deteriorating situation in Syria. Now, there are reports today, and I haven't followed them with any detail, but there have been reports of big protests by Syrian Christians following the ransacking of churches. They've even been discussed this morning in the British media. I'm not sure what to make of these reports. I haven't been able to track them carefully. Big Serge has written a huge piece on his absolutely invaluable Substack blog about the causes of Syria's collapse, the Syrian Arab Republic's collapse. And he appears to say that it's a combination of three factors. The fact that Syria is a very diverse country, very difficult to hold together, but that all components of the country need to operate together economically in order to sustain the whole. And this has not been possible because of Kurdish and American control of the eastern grain fields and of the oil wells, and of course because of the effect of the sanctions. And he also highlights the additional pressure on Syria caused by rapid population growth. He makes the point that in 1970, when Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, became the president of Syria, the population of Syria was 7 million. And in 2011, at the start of the conflict, the uprising against President Bashar al-Assad, the population had grown to 22 million. That makes it all sound a little bit too much to me, as if what is being described here is some kind of Malthusian collapse, that Syria basically outgrew its resources, and as a result of the sanctions, it couldn't support its population, and that this caused the country to be hollowed out. I think there is a lot of truth to this. I don't think it's the whole story. For one thing, it ignores the fact that Syria has been receiving a great deal of economic aid from its allies. The Iranians have been supplying it with oil. The Russians have been supplying it with grain and food. And though undoubtedly conditions in Syria economically have been very hard, we have not yet seen an economic or humanitarian catastrophe. There's been no reports of famine or anything of that kind. And to repeat again, an active and dynamic government could, in my opinion, have found ways through. Maybe they could not have resolved all of Syria's problems, but they could have certainly mitigated the effect. And the Assad government, for any number of reasons about which we do not have full details, failed to do so. Nonetheless, it's an interesting article. You can find it all on Big Serge's Substack blog, and I would say certainly that it's worth reading. Now, the situation, putting aside the question of protests about Christians, the situation in eastern Syria is beginning to become increasingly tense. Predictably, the new authorities in Syria are now talking about creating joint forces with Turkey to take action against the Kurds in eastern Syria. Now, that is a euphemism for agreeing for the Turkish army to enter eastern Syria and to take direct military action against the Kurds. Because, to be clear, HTS and its various organizations are in no position themselves to do anything of the sort. And, well, that could set up the situation for a direct confrontation between the United States and Israel on the one hand, who support the Kurds, and Turkey on the other. I'm not definitely saying that that will happen, but it is the case that there is now increasing rhetoric, both on the Turkish side and on the Israeli side, expressing hostility to each other. Erdogan has been talking about how Jerusalem was once a city within the Ottoman Empire, and what a shame it was that after the fall of the empire, the Turks had to leave. The Israelis, for their part, appear to be taking umbrage to these words. But anyway, the tensions appear to be rising. And a couple of programs ago, I discussed that extraordinary article in the American Enterprise Institute by Michael Rubin, American neocon, who was talking about how the United States should be prepared to bomb the Turkish army and kill Turks in Syria. So it looks as if the situation could start to deteriorate, and deteriorate rapidly. We'll see. But just to finish, I've been rereading Putin's comments about Syria, the ones that he made at his Q&A and press conference the other day, a couple of days ago. And I have to say that reading them carefully, it does seem to me very much as if Putin, at least, has now made a decision to exit Syria, that the Russians have made a decision to exit Syria. And he poses the question, we must reflect on how our relations will evolve with the political forces currently in control and those that will govern the country in the future. our interests must align. Should we remain, notice the use of the word should, we must act in the interests of the host nation. What will those interests entail? What can we do for them? These are all, he poses all these questions. These questions demand careful consideration on both sides. We are already capable of offering assistance, including utilising our bases. We have extended this proposal to our partners within Syria and the neighbouring nations. Neighbouring nations clearly refers to Turkey and to Erdogan. For instance, we suggested employing the Khmeimim air base for the delivery of humanitarian aid to Syria, and this was met with understanding and a willingness to collaborate. The same applies to the Tartus naval base. Now, if military bases are converted to humanitarian purposes, then they cease to be military bases. They become something completely different. And whether or not Khmeimim and Tartus will be converted to this end, as Putin says, and will remain under Russian control, the point is that the Russian military, in any significant form, based on this proposal, looks as if it is definitely pulling out of Syria. It's going to refocus on Libya instead. And I'm going to say this, that given that part of Erdogan's purpose in allowing the bases, the Russian bases, to remain in Syria was to use the bases as leverage both over the Russians and the Americans, I doubt that Erdogan would see bases being used for these humanitarian purposes as providing him with that sort of leverage. And it is likely, therefore, that a decision is going to be made at some point within the next few weeks for the bases to be closed. Now, there's been a superb article discussing all of this by the Indian diplomat, the former Indian diplomat M.K. Bhadrakumar, and he has discussed Putin's comments in an extremely fine way on his blog. He says Putin weighs in on the Syrian situation, and I would think that's fair to say that Bhadrakumar's assessment is very much in line with the one that I have just given. And the long and the short of it is that the Russians are pulling out of Syria, but they are pulling out in an organized, an orderly, and I would even say dignified way. And Bhadrakumar makes the same point. The speed with which Assad was given asylum in Moscow and the peaceful transfer of power in Damascus hinted that the Kremlin was not taken by surprise. Compare the chaotic and desperate US evacuation on August 16, 2021 from Kabul airport with Afghans falling from the sky as American military planes took off. Yet Western propaganda is painting the town red that Russia has been defeated in Syria. And I think this is exactly the point. Whatever you may think about the Russian intervention in Syria and how it ended, the way it has all been tied up together and the way the Russians are pulling out is impressive. They seem to be pulling out and saying, so be it. We came here, we did all we could. Now it's no longer our problem, it's Turkey's problem, and Israel's problem, and the US's problem, and of course the Syrians' problem. We're prepared to help, we can provide humanitarian assistance, but don't ask us to do more than this. From this point on, it's up to you. And I think this is wise and rational statesmanship of the sort which, from the current administration in Washington, with its chaotic exit from Afghanistan, its failure, as Badr Kumar points out, to have any dealings with former Afghan President Ghani, the contrast being with Putin's statement that he is indeed going to meet with Assad at some point over the next few weeks. In other words, the Russians are treating Assad himself with respect and courtesy. And of course, not just this contrast over the Russian actions in Afghanistan, in Syria, and with the American actions in Afghanistan, but also this sulky conduct with the additional sanctions on Russian energy exports, supposedly in order to strengthen the hands of the new incoming administration, but in reality, as I said, simply to make more trouble. The contrast is truly remarkable and not to the current administration's credit. Well, there it is. This is where I'm going to finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Let me once again wish you all a very happy and joyous Christmas. Look forward to seeing you after Christmas and before the New Year holiday. And until then, have a very good day and a very good series of days.